So welcome everyone, nice to see you all. This is our third session of Maimonides' Guide. We've been gently going forward, reading parts of the introduction and exploring some of the basic ideas that form the context of where the guide comes from, and also its place within the tradition and how it was received. That was last week. On the first week I did more of an introduction to Jewish philosophy in general. We read the epistle and the introductory epistle of the guide in the very first session. Last week we read more of the preface, and today I'd like to answer in more depth a question I think Alan asked me, because I think one comes to a very interesting and important place. And then we'll be reading more of the preface, and God willing, Be'ezrat Hashem, or probably how Maimonides would say it, inshallah, we'll get into the first chapter of the guide and begin to read as far as we get. And we're not going to be reading the whole guide, but we'll be going to different sections. And in many ways, the second and third section of the guide, which are in the second volume, have a lot of the stuff that I'd like to spend a good amount of time on. But they're in the first part, we are going to be jumping around. But there are long sections in the next parts that I'd like to spend some time, because I find them to be very interesting. So last week, again, if anybody has any questions or thoughts that are left over, let's talk about them a little bit later. I think it was you, Alan, who asked me, well, what do the Orthodox think about Maimonides, right, in the guide, right? What do the ultra-Orthodox think about Maimonides' guide? And so I wanted to go more deeply into that and come up with one answer from one Orthodox thinker. And I think it's really important because it really gets into what is the guide, why is it so interesting to read it, why is Maimonides such a powerful figure in Judaism, and how does everything we've already been reading about relate to traditional Judaism? I mean, in some sense, he seems to be almost anti-traditional Judaism, because he talks about how those who only study the law are not able to understand the highest truths and the highest wisdom. And he's really in some ways dismissive about some of the basic tenets of Judaism, like the belief in Mashiach and Messiah, or the idea of God that acts in the world, or and many scholars aren't really sure what he truly believes about at the afterlife. And he talks about what the tradition says about the afterlife, but he puts in a few hints that might not be what he thinks about. So I'm not going to an ultra-Orthodox thinker, because it would be hard to find one who would really address this full on. But I'm going to David Hartman. And David Hartman is a very open-minded Orthodox thinker, but he is also very committed to halakha, right? So David Hartman was a student of Soloveitchik. Soloveitchik was the leader of the modern Orthodox movement in the 20th century. Soloveitchik was completely committed to the covenant, to following Jewish law, to the utmost, and very dismissive, by the way, the Rav, of conservative and Reform Judaism, and even telling his students, that they shouldn't interact with conservative and Reform rabbis. But he was a very interesting thinker, and in his Talmud shiur, he taught Talmud to a whole generation or several generations of Orthodox rabbis. He brought in a lot of philosophy. And so Hartman, who was a student of Soloveitchik and really imbibed a lot of that rational way of looking at Talmud and philosophic way of looking at Judaism, of bringing more of a theological context to traditional Judaism. And just like the Rav, steadfast in his idea that to be Jewish is to be in the context of that covenant of mitzvot, of traditions that are binding on Israel, but willing to be a bit more interesting in his thinking. And David Hartman, he ended up creating the Hartman Center, which is probably now the most important Jewish think tank, I guess is how you would call it, in the world. It's in Jerusalem, the Hartman Center, and it educates not only the Jews of Jerusalem, but also many of the most influential rabbis and educators in America are fellows over there and spend a month of summer there and do all kinds of programs there. And there's really nothing else like it. It has, I think, between 100 and 150 scholars on its staff. And they're really the most interesting scholars, touching all areas of Judaism and anything related to Jewish peoplehood. And they're just so interesting. And so it's not Hartman anymore, but his son, Daniel, who runs that. And Hartman was also in his own way open-minded halachically. He's the one who created this new concept in modern orthodoxy of the partnership minyan, right? Where you have 10 he can't get rid of, you need 10 men in the minyan, but he created this idea where you also need 10 women. You can't start until you have 10 men and 10 women. So that's his way of making orthodoxy egalitarian. And he also said, well, women can't chant Torah, they can lead parts of the service, and he went as far as he could. So if any of you have been to Jerusalem, Shira Chadashah in Jerusalem is the minyan associated with Hartman, where they practice this kind of Judaism. So women lead Kabbalat Shabbat, they read Torah, they have aliyot, but they don't lead an Amidah. So Hartman comes in. He's a very close friend of Shlomo Pines, who is the translator of our version of the guide. Hartman is very troubled by the idea that Maimonides, the Nesher, the ego, would be anti-halacha. How could Maimonides be anti-halacha? And how could he put Greek philosophy, something that's outside of his own tradition, above halacha, above the viewpoint of our tradition? And Hartman sees that the current stream of scholarship, including Strauss, who did the introduction to the translation that we read, have gone more and more in the direction of seeing Maimonides as really a philosopher, right? Maimonides is not, the way they see it, Maimonides is essentially a philosopher who also was brought up in this rabbinic world and took a leadership position, but he's essentially a Jewish philosopher, and puts the ideas of philosophy above the ideas that he receives from the tradition. And they point to all those places in the guide where he says, well, if you're really clued into this and you're not among the vulgar or the ignoramuses, and has all these very philosophic ideas. So Hartman asked a question. So who is Maimonides? Is Maimonides a halachist or a philosopher? And where is his heart? Is his heart in Jerusalem? Is his heart at Sinai? Is his heart in Revelation? Or is his heart in Athens, in reason and intellectual apprehension and individual contemplation? Again, a lot of the scholars, they find it easy to say that Hartman, that Maimonides is a Greek philosopher, and almost like a philosopher king who says, well, I can only give so much of this philosophy to my people because they're not quite there yet. So they should continue believing these ridiculous ideas like Tchiyat HaMetim, the raising of the dead, or that God works through history, or in Messianism. But for those who really know the truth, that's what it's about. And you can see reading the guide, what we've read so far, how easy it would be to see that. But Hartman has an interesting argument. He says that to look at Maimonides this way as just a philosopher really makes it quite kind of boring, because then Maimonides is just someone who's bringing Greek philosophy that's been around for over 1,000 years in a slightly different context, and it's already been published. So what's so interesting about Maimonides? Is he just bringing Greek philosophy to Jews now? And so it takes away from how interesting Maimonides really is. And so Hartman can't believe that Maimonides, who spent so much of his time, right? If you only study the guide, then that's what you think. But he spent most of his career writing about the other parts of Judaism. He wrote the Mishneh Torah, the guide, our first code of Jewish law, and put his heart and soul into it. It doesn't seem like he just wrote it like a side venture. And he wrote, even before he was 20, he wrote a commentary on the Mishnah, which he continually revised. And what Hartman points out, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to bring this whole idea I think is so interesting, is he says, you see from the very beginning, Maimonides always brings philosophy into whatever he does. And he is deeply embedded in Jewish tradition. And Maimonides is the one who spends hours every day writing, giving decisions of Jewish law, psak, seeing people. He is deeply devoted to his people and to community, right? Greek philosophy is not interested in community. I mean, on some level, maybe it's interested in society, but Judaism is all about community. And he says, Maimonides clearly loves community and is embedded in the story of the Jewish people. And in the end, this is what he says. Hartman says that what he comes up with is a synthesis of philosophy and Judaism that enriches Judaism with something that had been in the background. So I just want to share a screen, and we're going to read just one of his quotes from Hartman's really important book.
Did Hartman think that Maimonides was looking for personal intellectual balance, and that's why he took these two and almost put them on a scale, if you will?
I think we're going to get there, but I think he actually saw that it was already in that through Maimonides' eyes, who genuinely believed that this is the truth of the universe. For him, Greek philosophy wasn't just a tradition, but he felt this was the truth of the universe. And in his mind, he thought, how could the Torah not contain this truth? So he might have actually seen it in the Torah. He wasn't trying to put it there, but he actually saw it. And to him, he felt it's just there. And through his eyes, he was discovering or bringing to light something that he generally believed had always been in the Torah, but had been lost touch of because of the exile, because of all of that time. So I think he was balancing it, but I think even more what he was trying to do, and this we'll get to it, is he saw how important this way of thinking was, and he wanted to gently bring it into Judaism or bring it to light, whether he saw it as it was already there or did see that it was something outside. But this is what Hartman kind of brings in his book, which is so interesting, is that through all of his commentaries on everything, all his other books on Jewish law, he's always bringing a little bit of philosophy here and there. And the guide is maybe where he brings the most and in the most clear way, but everywhere he's bringing the same ideas because he thinks that this is something that Judaism needs. And you almost see it as this gentle force, comment upon comment, building a different way of perceiving Judaism. You have to have pretty broad shoulders to do something like that and not be put into cherem, not be put into excommunicated, but he was somebody who could do that. Alan, do you mind reading for us Maimonides' Torah and Philosophic Quest? So here he's exploring this idea of is Maimonides Greek, or where does he live? Jerusalem or in Greece? Go ahead.
Perhaps he inhabits neither city, not if they are understood as two polarized frameworks of theoretical and practical value. A new yet old Jerusalem may emerge once Athens enters into history. The concept of nature and the contemplative ideal inspired by a God who is revealed through the ordered laws of nature may grow in Jerusalem without destroying the city's unique quality. Athens may provide a wider understanding of what the Sinai moment implicitly demanded. Once the outgrowths of Athens have taken root in the soil of Jerusalem, both cities may not need to remain opposing spiritual poles. A new spiritual synthesis with different categories may emerge. Man may remain fully within the way of Jerusalem and yet deeply appreciate and appropriate the way of Athens.
So you can imagine that Hartman may say this. You probably wouldn't find an ultra-Orthodox leader say quite go as far as him. So Hartman then, it's going to bring you a little bit more of Hartman's thought. I think it's important. Hartman goes further with this idea and to show that really Maimonides sees it as embedded in Judaism. You know, we started reading already in the guide last week, this talk about parables and how parables reveal the deeper truths. And Maimonides goes on and on about parables and stories. And so Hartman in Maimonides' commentary to the Mishnah points out that Maimonides sees that in this, the most important division in the Talmud is between law and midrash, right? Between all the laws and all the extrapolation and discussion of what the law is, and then all the stories, the Agadah. So he says that in the Agadah and the Talmud, or within the Talmud itself, all those stories are really stories of philosophy, are really stories that reveal the deeper truths. So Maimonides is then turning those early rabbis in the Talmud into philosophers. So he clearly thinks that, and he really believes this. So he clearly thinks that Judaism has always had this, but it's just been lost. He sees that philosophy everywhere. And we're going to see a little bit later some of how he understands those parables in a philosophic way. So what Hartman says is the Maimonides in the end doesn't question the law because he thinks the law is important to follow for ethical, moral reasons, but he does get to a point where what's more important than only following the law, because that's become automated and the observant Jew, is then looking at those parables, at the Agadah, at the Midrash, and then when you look and examine those, you get to see the real secrets that take one into the metaphysics and to the contemplation and all of it.
So Rabbi, does Maimonides, is Hartman saying that in some ways Judaism alone is insufficient?
I think it's a really good question, and I think Hartman would say that maybe that vision of the Judaism at that moment needed the input from Greek philosophy, from Athens, to grow, to be I'm trying to think how to put this, to have a place on the marketplace of ideas, right, within Christianity and Islam and everything, all the debates that were happening in medieval times. So maybe it was needed, and I guess Hartman does believe that maybe not Judaism was insufficient, but that religions have to grow, and sometimes you only grow through outside, through bringing in from the outside.
I think we're looking at this slightly askew. Maimonides is no believer in Aristotle. Maimonides is using Aristotle as a method,
the foil,
in order to get to a certain thing. He's also comparing Aristotle with the Mutakalliman. He spends as much time on the Islamic current philosophy in the book as he does with Aristotle. Now, the interesting thing about both Aristotle and the Mutakalliman is they're exactly the opposite of each other. The Mutakalliman have no sense of nature. They have God creating the world afresh every split second. There's no sameness to anything that can't be changed by God. Aristotle has exactly the opposite. So why? I've thought about this a lot. So why is Maimonides having these two philosophers go at each other? What is he trying to show us by having us think through Aristotle and using Aristotle to get to Aristotle's sense of the divine, which is the unmoved mover, or the endless recurrence of the same, as Nietzsche found the same thing, and it sort of troubled him and made him a little bit crazy. And then the Mutakalliman, where in fact the sense of the divine is completely the opposite of that. And I think the greatness of Maimonides is he uses these two philosophies as methods. As methods, we're not sure where he's taking us with this, but these are methods that essentially open your mind and take you perhaps to a knowledge of the divine, which can't be spoken of clearly, because the divine, you can't fit the divine into the fourfold root of sufficient reason. You know, we can't fit the divine into a box. So and the other thing is when you think about the divine in Maimonides' way, you lose the relationship between the subject, you as the thinker, and the object that you're actually thinking about. Both of these things are methods. So I would not take seriously at all that Maimonides is trying to bring Greek philosophy into Judaism. I think what he's trying to do is bring an occasional Jew to actually the knowledge of the divine. Anyway, that's my spiel about.
Thank you. I appreciate it. As you were describing it, I was thinking about the Kuzari and Yehuda Halevi's book, where he's also setting up different philosophies, but there he's setting Judaism against them.
Yeah, well, we shouldn't take philosophy seriously, except as you know, these are just versions of the truth. Maimonides, I guarantee you, did not think that Aristotle's philosophy was the absolute truth. In fact, he says that lots of times in his book.
Yeah, so I think you're right. He didn't see it as the absolute. Didn't see it as the absolute truth, but there's a lot of ideas around the whole philosophic way of thinking, of being, of looking at reality. And some of the ideas that he does take on are not ideas that you would have easily found in Judaism beforehand. So there were some new ideas coming in, which he kind of comes to through this discussion with Greek philosophy. So it's not like he's saying, I love this Greek philosophy, I want to bring into Judaism, but through his encounter with it, he does bring in new ideas.
Well, what about, but with the Greek philosophy, you also have to speak about the Mutakalman, because he spends almost as much time, as much paper in the guide on the Mutakalman. So what's he doing with the Mutakalman? Is he bringing the Mutakalman philosophy into Judaism too?
So I think what Hartman would say, at least, is that even though the Mutakalim are obviously Islamic philosophers and not Greek philosophy, he would say that they're still part of a conversation of philosophy going back. So I'm not sure if he would see them as. I'll go look up and see what Hartman says about it. But I'd like to get to that idea that you brought up next week, where I'd like to talk about and get into Maimonides and begin to explore his ideas of apprehension of God and how important that is to Maimonides. But here today, what I wanted to do is, we were in this introduction was talking really about Maimonides and his relationship with the received tradition, and what is really interesting about it, and kind of the insights of Hartman. So just to finish those, because I think it does, he takes us almost there. And this again works into what you were saying, because even though he doesn't always bring the exact belief of Aristotle, although he does, there are moments in the guide where he says, well, how was the world created? And he presents three different versions, one which was more like the Islamic philosophers, one which was more like Aristotle, and one which seems closer to the Jewish one. And he really says, I don't know which one it is, but he seems to hint, I would probably prefer this one over the other two. So he is kind of balancing them. So here he's saying this final idea of Maimonides, of Hartman, that I find really interesting. And he points how Maimonides is much more universal than traditional Judaism can sometimes be, right? Traditional Judaism, maybe especially at that time, would say all of the truth is only available to Jews, right? There's no other place where you can find truth. Truth is only in the Torah, and truth comes from Judaism. And Maimonides has this universalistic side to him, where he's talking about the idea that wisdom is scientific. You can access wisdom and access God, whoever you are, whether you're Jewish or not Jewish, and depends on your ability to apprehend God, even though Moses is the greatest of all prophets and so on. So there's this quote in the Talmud where it says that you cannot find God except in the 4 cubits of halacha, right? That says this in the Talmud, meaning that God can only be found through a relationship through the mitzvot. And Maimonides takes exception to this And he says, well, what about the people who lived before the Sinai? What about the patriarchs and matriarchs? They didn't have a relationship with God. And so he goes on to this whole discussion about other people being able to access this. I wanted to go back to that document, and we're going to read very quickly the other quote. Paul, do you mind reading?
I have a question because I'm not sure I have clarity. Hartman talks in the first quote that Alan read about synthesis, and David is talking today about methodology. And so I'm not sure that we're on the same wavelength.
That's right. They're not.
I need to understand where the breakdown is here, because it's leading me in two different directions.
So I think what you're sensing is Hartman and David have two different agendas, so to speak. You know, David Hartman is coming as a very traditional Jew, and a rabbi, and an Orthodox rabbi, and he wants to bring Maimonides more into a conversation that fits what he wants, how he views Maimonides. I mean, let me think about it. You know, David is talking about methodologies, and I think Maimonides is clearly using a methodology, but throughout all of his works, he is bringing up ideas that are different than you would find, right? This was a question from last week. Rashi and Maimonides. Rashi only quotes Midrash. Rashi only quotes received Jewish tradition. He has a completely different stance, right? A completely different lens of looking at Judaism. And you find it in his commentary on the Mishnah. Even in the Mishnah Torah at the beginning, he does introduce ideas of Greek philosophy. He might not say, I'm bringing Aristotle, in one piece into Judaism, but he has ideas of, God not being able to act, or God not acting through history, because at some level he is the unmoved mover. And so there are ideas which are quite foreign to what Rashi would ever talk about and to what Midrash would ever talk about. And you can't avoid that. So David Hartman is responding to that, and then responding to those voices that are saying, well, Maimonides wasn't really a frum Jew. Maimonides was a radical, or Maimonides was disdainful of tradition. And he's trying to bring Maimonides with intellectual honesty back into the fold of his view of Orthodox, of an observant Jewish leader who was trying to do something from that viewpoint. So when he was, I think where Hartman eventually finishes, and he would say, yes, you're right. Maimonides is just bringing a few methodologies because what's most important to him is the apprehension of God. But why does he speak about all these things and all the other things and the commentary to the Mishnah? Why does he talk about it in all of these other places? Because he's not only trying to create a methodology for apprehending God, but he's trying to transform Judaism, because he thinks that Judaism has to broaden to be all that it can be, to survive, to move forward. And this is also why I see Maimonides, like Hartman, as one of the very first figures who, and I think this is where, in some ways, the guide is incredibly interesting, is seeing Maimonides as a figure who wants to transform Judaism and gently bring, not only take those Jews who might be open enough to philosophy, and this is Hartman's big point, that Maimonides isn't only trying to take those Jews who might be open to philosophy, take them further in their path, but he's trying to take, on some level, every Jew, wherever he is, however pious he is, however learned he is, and give him a little bit more. And that's why he does open up the Mishnah Torah with all these different chapters about philosophy. It's not as deep or as extensive as a guide, but he does bring it to them. In his commentary on the Mishnah, he does bring it to them because he's trying to reach everyone where they're at and try and take them forward to take in these new ideas. Because and this is also what Hartman says, Judaism doesn't really have a theology, right? were religion of doing. And so Maimonides, by bringing all of these ideas and this focus on metaphysics and on contemplation and what God is or isn't, is also helping people bring another element into Judaism that perhaps wasn't as much in the fore. And so, one of Maimonides clearly loves Rabbi Akiva, and I'll end here and then we'll read this and then we're going to start to read. So Rabbi Akiva was the rabbi who, after the destruction of the temple, maybe was the one most responsible for saving Judaism. Rabbi Akiva is famous in the Talmud because he not only interpreted every word of the Torah, but even the crowns on the letters, right? Because he wanted to give Judaism as much flexibility post-destruction of the temple to take it forward into new territory. And if you can interpret even every letter in the Torah, then you can really say anything about the Torah you want and take Judaism forward, right? And that's what Rabbi Akiva does. And there's that midrash where, Moses is, on Mount Sinai, and it's the 40 days and 40 nights. And God appears to him and says, do you want to see what happens in the future? And Maimonides and Moses suddenly ends up in the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Akiva, and he hears Rabbi Akiva talking about the Torah. And Moses doesn't understand a single word that Akiva is saying because it's so far away from the Torah. But then he hears Akiva say, and this is the Torah from Moses at Sinai. And that makes Moses feel better because he says, at least he's trying to preserve what I'm doing. So Maimonides loves Rabbi Akiva, not only because of that, but also because of the story of the Pardes. What's the Pardes? That's the heavenly orchard where 4 rabbis go to explore metaphysical truths. Anybody who's and so if you've read As a Driven Leaf, you know this story, right? So there are 4 rabbis who go up into the heavenly orchard to explore metaphysics, and only one of them comes back, and that's Rabbi Akiva. He goes in peace and comes back in peace. Acher, who is the subject of As a Driven Leaf, becomes a heretic. One person dies in divine ecstasy, and the other person loses his mind. And so I think Maimonides sees himself as Rabbi Akiva. He's the one who entered the orchard in peace and was able to go into the metaphysical world and leave in peace. And as Rabbi Akiva, he sees himself as one who is bringing in new methodologies, as David said, but also new ways of looking at Judaism. And so, to finish that thought, that's where I think Maimonides is somebody that we can all, that's relatable, especially in this day, and what he's doing back then, whether it's bringing in new methodologies or an even broader approach to Judaism, is that there are times in Judaism when Judaism, because it's in a transition point, has to expand and create synthesis with other bodies of ideas. And that's for the enrichment of our tradition, and one of the reasons that conservative Judaism also embraces, I think, Maimonides. And I feel very akin to Maimonides because I very much agree with that. And I see this period of our history as also being a period where Judaism has to learn, is bringing in new tools, new ways in worship and study and what community is and approach to God, so that it can have what it needs to thrive in the future. So let's, did that answer did that answer some of what you were asking, Paul?
I think it's a good summary of perplexment.
Do you mind reading for us the second quote? It relates to what we were talking about a while ago, but.
This matter was not made known through the prophets alone, but also the wise men of the ancient nations, even though they never saw the prophets nor heard their words, already knew that man is not whole unless he includes within himself knowledge and practice.
So here we have, again, Maimonides making a statement that you'd be harder pressed to find Rashi make it the same way. And that's the, truth is universal, right? The wise men of the ancient nations, even though they never saw the prophets, they were already able to discern some of these metaphysical truths, or the beginning of them. And I think that's important to Maimonides because he sees, for him, truth is scientific and something that we should be able to access. So anybody have any thoughts or comments before we move on to our reading?
I have just a question about those two passages. I had thought that the first one was Hartman, a quote from Hartman.
Yeah.
It was it? It was not
Sorry,
Maimonides.
the second one is not Hartman. The second
And the
one
second
is Maimonides. Yeah.
It is Maimonides,
It is
but
Maimonides,
quoted by Hartman. Yeah, the second one I got, but I couldn't. Okay, that clears up.
Yeah,
my
the
question.
second one is Maimonides in the commentary to the Mishnah.
In the Mishnah, not in the guide. Okay.
So you can even see how he's bringing these ideas in these ways. That could easily be in the guide, right? That's like the kind of sentence that you would easily find in the guide, but it's coming from his commentary on the Mishnah. So, and again, the commentary on Mishnah he revised throughout his whole life. He wrote it before he was 20, but then he went back and inserted some of his later ideas throughout his life. Okay.
Confused about something since I picked up this volume and I picked up the other one that David recommended, the one with the 4 essays in it, the art of writing, or the whatever that was.
Sure.
And that is that now Leostrauss he's a historian, but he's also a Plato scholar, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he's based at the University of Chicago, where they worship Greek thought and literature, right?
Mm-hmm.
Philosophy is in everything. There's the philosophy of philosophy, philosophy of history, philosophy of medicine, philosophy of science. My understanding from having read Plato and Aristotle and struggled with them in college is that it's a means to an end, right? Plato presenting this Socratic method that develops into Aristotelian logic is still very much with us, and is still very much at shul when it comes down to, now I've never been to a Talmudic argument among Hachems, but isn't that part of what scholars of Talmud and Torah do, is that they're arguing in some sort of logical format. Well, anyway, the structure of the argument tends to come from this sort of philosophy, right? I mean, one thing Plato and Aristotle have given us is a method for rationally discerning the truth of a matter, right? So
that, I think, do you have a question, or can I, do you want to?
Yeah, my question is confusion, because everything I've read in the guide, everything I've read from Leostrauss, everything I've read in the introduction so far, and it's so dense, I can only get through like 10 pages in a day. Sure. And then I have to think about it for a while, right? But everything I've read so far is pointing to Greek logic. And now we're talking about traditional Judaism and how it approaches analyses of important texts, whether they be halakha, or whether they be Torah, or whatever. Okay, I'm not seeing the distinction between the Greek philosophic approach and
the Talmudic approach.
One.
I think that's a great question, and I think that, so I'll answer by way of a story. So when I was studying Talmud in rabbinical school, my chavruta, my study partner, was now a rabbi in Phoenix, and he was someone who majored in maths and was a mathematician. So he had that kind of logical, rational brain. And we were studying Talmud. He was always trying to apply his reason and ration to Talmud, and it never worked. He was always led completely astray. And because the Talmud is not logical, it has certain methodologies and rules within it that they try and apply in a methodological way, but the Talmud is much more associative. The rabbis are not, they have the 13 principles of Rabbi Yishmael, which they probably derived. This is again an earlier download from Greek civilization. They're kind of tools of looking at Torah, how you can take laws from the Torah and expand them and use them to as proof of new laws. But even then, even though they state the 13 laws of Rabbi Ishmael are the basis of the Talmud, they really do all kinds of things. The Talmud is not rational; it's totally associative. And in some ways, a literary background is a lot more useful than a mathematical, logical mind in studying Torah.
Illusions and parables, yeah.
Because it's parables, but it's also they're not thinking straight. They're thinking in the realm of imagination. They're thinking they're doing things that you would never do if you were strictly being rational and reason, because they have a goal in mind, and they're just and they're also bringing all kinds of ideas and stories within it. So whenever we would have what we'd call a Talmud blind. What's a Talmud blind? When you're in rabbinical school, you get given a piece of Talmud, you have a dictionary, no phones and no this, and you have to figure out what it's saying. My friend who was a mathematician always struggled because he thought it should be logical. It should go from A to B to C to D, but it would go from A to M. And the only way you would ever be able to guess where it was going would be by really having your mind be a very creative, open place, and then allowing your mind to get there. So later scholarship in Talmud then kind of attacks that creative place from a very thorough, very sharp mind to argue points of Jewish law, but it's always within this system that's kind of associative. It's not just so before I became even a journalist, I studied law. I went to law school as an undergrad in England, and going from studying law to then studying Talmud, Jewish law is much more difficult than straight law, because straight law makes sense, pretty much. Even British law, which is has all kinds of strange things in it, compared to Talmudic law, which is really because it's drawing on so many different worlds and Torah and received tradition, and they have their methodologies, but they easily it's like learning French grammar. There are rules, but the rules are there to be broken. So I think so. You're right. Maimonides he's bringing in the intellectual reason and rationality of that world into the way he's looking at Jewish theology, which isn't what Midrash is doing, right? Midrash on its simple meaning is not that at all, right? Midrash is stories and much more emotive, and in some ways actually Kabbalah, which is linked to what Maimonides is doing, because they're both about bringing a spiritual aspect into Judaism. Kabbalah in some ways is then a reaction to Maimonides' philosophy, because it's too rational, it's too intellectual. Kabbalah looks at what Maimonides is doing and says, you've taken out some of the most interesting aspects of our tradition, which is the imaginative, which is the idea that God is beyond any boxes. You can't just say, Maimonides says God can't really interfere in the world. But the Kabbalah says, absolutely God can do that, because God is everything Maimonides says it is, and God is more, right? That's the difference between Maimonides' view and panentheism, which says God is everything in the world but more, right? So Kabbalah then becomes a reaction to some of the very reasonable, rational God of the philosophers and of Maimonides.
Do you think Maimonides is trying to deliberately shift the paradigm, or is he just trying to introduce some sort of additional factors of consideration? Or is he actually trying to shift?
I think Maimonides is trying to introduce dialectic, not Jewish dialectic, but he has a method to be able to get to the divine, which was a classical way of getting to the divine, where each person took a side of an argument and you worked it in a rational way until the rationality gave way to something. And the experience you had when the rationality gave way was sort of an opening, whatever that is. So Maimonides is probably, and Maimonides, by the way, is very much against the use of imagination. Okay, imagination during his time was sort of a low-level thing.
Yes.
People who used their imagination were not to be spoken, they weren't to be taken seriously. So, and in fact, in the later Jewish philosopher Spinoza has a real differentiation between the level of imagination, the level of reason, and then the level of either inspiration or intuition, which comes at the top of the whole thing. So Maimonides is trying to I think he's probably trying to shift it from what the rabbi talks about as the heavy use of imagination to a reasoned approach, where you take two sides of this thing, like, for example, Aristotle and the Mutakalliman. You're going to compare Aristotle and the Mutakalliman, and you're going to go up the ladder of comparing them until you understand, or you don't understand, or something opens up for you. So he's trying to bring that particular method that the Greeks really knew very, very well and really refined into Jewish thought. I think for sure he's trying to do that, because that particular method actually works to be able to get you closer to the thing that you're looking for.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I really think and that's why Maimonides wants to reinterpret all these parables, because if the parables are just taken in their basic meaning, they don't have that, they're not rational enough for him, and he sees them as he thinks to understand them in their simple meaning brings a serious thinker no benefit, which is why he wants to spend so much time reinterpreting those parables along his lines, or interpreting them from his point of view.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
in the daily prayer book, there's 13 principles of hermeneutic examination of text. And I'm just wondering, was that part of the Aristotelian effort to be able to analyze text and be able to come to grips with it? And does that precede Maimonides, or is it after Maimonides?
It does. Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Those are the 13 principles of Rabbi Ishmael that are, kind of Mishnaic around then. So that's what I was saying. That was the previous download. That was right. The book As a Driven Leaf, in some ways describes the last big time where Judaism was, in conversation with Hellenic culture, and that was around, the beginning of the rabbis, right? So the rabbis were, again, just like Maimonides, a lot of the Greek culture they were rejecting, but within that conversation, they also took in a lot of they took on these 13. They're not Greek, they're Rabbi Ishmael, and I studied them. I can't remember exactly where they come from, but I think he might have taken them from principles within Greek ways of expounding texts. So there was a lot that was taken in at that time also of Greek ways of thinking in the Talmud, but then it was shifted into a very Jewish way of doing it, right? They didn't take everything, they took a little bit. And so in some ways they took a methodology then, and then Maimonides is now from his medieval time in looking at Greek philosophy, but also through his medieval lens, and also through the lens of the Islamic philosophy, as David's been talking about, again, in conversation with Judaism, and ultimately bringing in thought, bringing in methodologies, bringing in a certain lens to Judaism. And by the way, we all do this, right? So when Judaism arrived in America, and especially the Reform movement, but the focus on tikkun olam, on social justice, that came from meeting, right, the Protestant forms of Judaism that were in America, and that's where the big focus on social justice came from, right? That wasn't anywhere near as pervasive in even Reform Judaism in Germany, but in the way Judaism was lived. And in Israel, social justice isn't, Israelis do a lot of social justice work, but it's not part of their Judaism in the same way, because they don't have that tradition, or, the way we have an elevated bima and we clergy wear robes, right? That's all, the encounter of religion with surrounding traditions. So it's always happening, but this is I think Maimonides, because he has very, he's a very important figure, does it in a way that's has a big impact, maybe. So we've gone almost 55 minutes and we haven't looked at any text. So let's try and do at least a little bit. Let's see if I can get to my Kindle. Unless anybody else has any burning questions or thoughts. Let's see. We're gonna.
On page 8.
So I'm gonna move it ahead because we don't have much time.
Do you have a page number?
Yeah, we're getting there. So we're gonna start here. A page. Can't see the page. Let's see. Not sure how this Kindle, online Kindle works. Let's see. Sorry. Okay.
That's okay.
We're still in the preface.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yes, and we're
That
page
looks
12.
like page
Page
10.
12. Page 12. Now we're page 12.
Parables.
An
Oh.
example of the first kind of prophetic parable.
It's the following text.
Yeah.
So just I wanted to get into a little bit of him presenting some of his ideas. Okay, go ahead. Phil, how about?
Oh, sure. What am I reading from beginning there? Know that?
An example of the first kind, one paragraph down.
Oh, an example. I'm sorry. Okay. I'll read it from my book. It's easier for me. Thank you. An example of the first kind of prophetic parable is the following text. And behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and so on. In this text, the word ladder indicates one subject. The words set up on the earth indicate a second subject. The words and the top of it reach to heaven indicate a third subject. The words and behold, the angels of God indicate a fourth subject. The word ascending indicates a fifth subject. The words and descending indicate a sixth subject, and the words and behold, the Lord stood above it indicate a seventh subject. Thus, every word occurring in this parable refers to an additional subject in the complex of subjects represented by the parable as a whole.
So
And I might add in the
yeah, I didn't want it to get too detailed on what that means. I just wanted to show how he's trying to take parables, which to him have, what does this actually mean from his rational philosophic place? And he's trying to bring them a hidden meaning. So now we're going to look at another parable and see what he says about it. Okay, go ahead. An example.
and the footnotes give the words if you read them. An example of the second kind of prophetic parable is the following text. For at the window of my house I looked forth through my lattice, and I beheld among the thoughtless ones, I discerned among the youths, a young man void of understanding, passing through the street near her corner. And he went the way to her house. In the twilight, in the evening of the day, in the blackness of night and the darkness, and behold, there met him a woman with the attire of a harlot and wily of heart. She is riotous and rebellious, and so on. Now she is in the streets, now in the broad places, and so on. So she caught him, and so on. Sacrifices of peace offerings were due from me, and so on. Therefore came I forth to meet thee, and so on. I have decked with coverlets, and so on. I have perfumed my bed, and so on. Come, let us take our fill of love, and so on. For my husband is not at home, and so on. Bag of money, and so on. With her much fair speech, she causeth him to yield. With the blandishment of her lips, she enticeth him away.
Right.
The outcome of all this is a warning against the pursuit of bodily pleasures and desires. Accordingly, he, Solomon, likens matter, which is the cause of all these bodily pleasures, to a harlot who is also a married woman. In fact, his entire book is based on this allegory, and we shall explain in various chapters of this treatise his wisdom in likening matter to a married harlot, and we shall explain how he concluded this book of his with a eulogy of the woman who is not a harlot, but confines herself to attending to the welfare of her household and husband. For all the hindrances keeping man from his ultimate perfection, every deficiency affecting him and every disobedience come to him from his matter alone, as we shall explain in this treatise. This is the proposition that can be understood from this parable as a whole. Should I go on or stop?
You can go on. So I think what's really interesting here is, so this is Maimonides looks at this story, and how what he sees as the essence in his philosophic way is that it's about matter, right? It's about so it's not just the plain. You can't say it's just be about the plain understanding of the parable, but he likens it to a whole an example, a metaphor for matter, and not putting our efforts into spirit instead of matter. So
what you should also notice is the first parable. You know, Maimonides does nothing by chance.
Right.
So the first parable, not only structurally is different from this, but it has absolutely to do with an opposite thing, right? One of them is reaching God through a ladder in a dream, and the other is having a good time with a woman. And, you know, this is the way he operates. So if he mentions one subject and right after it, he's mentioning another subject, you can assume that the two subjects are related in some way, often being the opposite of each other. And that's a very important way for Maimonides to be able to teach dialectics too, is to have two things that are the opposite of each other, that are compared to each other, that are followed one by the other.
beautiful, thank you.
Beautiful indeed.
And I think definitely it's all that same going up the ladder would be, I guess, rejecting that we're moving beyond matter. Thank you for that. I really appreciate bringing that connection.
I have a question about these two parables then. David, don't go away. So then I also noticed that in addition to them content-wise being completely different, they're also structured very differently. I mean, the first kind of prophetic parable is like every phrase is defined, right? And he takes the time to define, this phrase needs to be defined in this one. But the second one, especially with the and so forths, right, which are omitting or ellipsing entire phrases that are descriptive but might be helpful to the interpretation, is completely different. The second one, it's almost as if the reader is being asked to take it in as a whole and to look at it very differently. We're not asked to, Maimonides is not telling us to analyze it phrase by phrase by phrase by phrase.
That's what the previous paragraph.
Yeah.
represents.
And it's in a paragraph, and it's weirdly punctuated, right?
Right. He doesn't tell us what that one's about, but he just he shows that there are different levels, right? There are 7 different levels to the
Well,
paragraph.
and the second one, you're using your imagination. Okay, the second one is an imaginative thing. The first parable is actually a logical thing. It's a rational thing of how you climb the ladder. And later on, in fact, he will talk about the first parable in real detail when he talks about the number 4. Okay, so he's into the number 4 too. But so the first parable has a lot of rational pieces to it. The second parable is a spew of imaginative stuff that when I was a young man, I would love to have heard and in fact been in that situation. But you know,
no comment.
Thank you, David. That answered it. One is rational and the other is very emotional.
It's interpreting.
Emotional, imaginative, sure. And they're the opposite again.
So one is a story. One is an image, right? One is an image of a ladder. So there's no story there to really use your imagination. It's just an image. which he's interpreting in a certain kind of way, and the other is a story with deeper meaning. But he's I mean, and I think this is where I want to leave today, and I have to run. And what I appreciate about Maimonides, and this is going to be some of my focus going forward, is Maimonides in many ways is trying to bring a rational but spiritual dimension to all the different parts of the Torah. Spiritual as in it's all about apprehending God. It's all about being, it's from an active intellect, from an intellectual point of view, but it's a spiritual understanding. So,
and he's also trying to work on our intellects. Okay, we shouldn't forget that as Nancy, it takes a long time to read each of these passages and think about this. Something is happening to her intellect, okay? In fact, what's happening, if you spend a lot of time on this, is your intellect is getting refined, and Maimonides is sort of hoping that your intellect will change from a potential, what he calls a potential intellect, to an actual intellect.
so
And the actual intellect in his philosophy has to do with.
So I hear you, and I think it's true, and I think there is the link with the Talmudic approach,
Right,
which is also about sharpening the mind.
They're trying to do the same thing.
I'm not as drawn as you, David, to that whole idea, because I think one can sharpen one's intellect in so many ways. And I think obviously it's there, but to me the most revolutionary important part of what Maimonides is doing is bringing in this more rational, spiritual aspect, and bringing this idea of the apprehension of God as being central to all these different things. And and it's true. I think obviously it's very important to him, the intellectual, the methodology that he's using to it. But from my lens, and again, we all look at Maimonides through our own lens. I think that the fact that he's using his intellect isn't really why he's getting there.
No. But rationality at the end of rationality, it breaks down. It breaks down and it becomes something that you might call spiritual. And that's where he wants to take you. It breaks it down. What happens is rationality encloses you in what's called the fourfold root of sufficient reason. But at a certain point, there's a crack in it. There are holes that form in it. You see where it begins to dismember itself. And at that particular point, you've gotten somewhere.
Okay, thank you. I think that's true. And we'll continue next week. We'll begin by reading the beginning of chapter 1, and then we'll go a little bit into different places in the first section. See you soon. Bye. Have a nice week.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Fascinating listening to you folks here. I'm learning something new every time I listen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.